The air over Arnhem was heavy with the acrid smell of smoke, gunpowder, and the distant echo of artillery fire. From London, it might have seemed like another distant battle, a line on a map, numbers on a report. But to Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the reports coming in were more than strategic, they were personal. He had spent months poring over plans, meeting generals, and weighing risks. The airborne operation, dubbed Operation Market Garden, was intended to be a bold stroke, a lightning assault that would cut through the German defenses in the Netherlands and open a path into the heart of Germany. On paper, it was brilliant, almost audacious in its simplicity. Drop paratroopers behind enemy lines, secure the bridges, and let the ground forces advance swiftly to consolidate gains. But paper, Churchill knew, had a dangerous way of hiding reality. Churchill's study was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across the room. Maps were spread across the table, pins marking key locations, red lines tracing the intended advance of the troops. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his mind restless. Reports from Arnhem had just arrived, and they carried a weight heavier than any dispatch he had received since the war began. Thousands of men were now trapped behind enemy lines, their position precarious, and the German forces, far from being surprised or overwhelmed, were regrouping and counterattacking with ferocity. The words of the officers in the field were polite but stark. Situation critical, reinforcements delayed, paratroopers under heavy fire. Churchill's eyes narrowed as he read the details. Bernard Montgomery, Field Marshal, had been the mastermind behind the plan. Churchill had long admired Montgomery for his precision, his careful planning, and his unshakable confidence. Monty, as he was known to his men, had been a hero in the public eye and in the eyes of his prime minister. His campaigns in North Africa had turned the tide against Rommel, and his strategic mind had been a beacon of hope. Yet Arnhem was different. Arnhem was messy, chaotic, and unpredictable, and Montgomery's approach seemed almost too rigid, almost too confident in the face of uncertainty. Churchill could almost hear Montgomery's voice in his mind, calm and measured, detailing every maneuver, every calculation, every anticipated contingency. The Field Marshal had laid out the plan with meticulous care, emphasizing precision timing, coordination, and the bravery of the airborne troops who would drop into enemy territory. On paper, it had seemed flawless, almost elegant in its execution, but reality had a way of exposing flaws that even the most brilliant minds could not foresee. The paratroopers had landed in scattered formations, supplies had not reached them in time, and the ground forces that were supposed to link up had been delayed by unexpected resistance. The plan, brilliant as it was, had faltered at every turn. The Prime Minister could not shake the image of those young men, barely out of their teens, many of them, fighting desperately in a foreign city under the shadow of enemy artillery. He thought of the families, waiting anxiously for letters, the mothers and fathers who would soon receive telegrams delivering devastating news. The human cost was immediate and profound. Churchill had always known war was brutal, but there was a difference between strategic setbacks and failures of leadership that directly endangered the lives of soldiers under one's command. And for the first time he wondered if Montgomery's brilliance had been clouded by arrogance, if his unwavering confidence had prevented him from seeing the peril his men faced. In the quiet of his study, Churchill's mind raced through every decision, every briefing, every moment he had spent with Montgomery. He remembered their early meetings, when Monty had been fresh from victories in North Africa, his reputation untarnished, his ego balanced by careful strategy. He remembered the first time they had discussed the plan for Arnhem, how Montgomery had outlined the operation with diagrams and charts, his confidence infectious, his clarity undeniable. Churchill had been impressed. He had believed in Montgomery. He had trusted him with lives, with resources, with the hopes of a nation weary from years of war, and yet now he could not ignore the reports. The plan had not just failed, it had endangered men who had placed their faith in their commander. Churchill rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the city beyond. London was alive with the usual wartime energy, the hum of air raid sirens, the distant rumble of bombs, the orderly chaos of a city holding itself together in the face of destruction. And yet, the storm of Arnhem raged thousands of miles away, invisible to most but vivid in Churchill's mind. He thought of the paratroopers, dropped into enemy territory with little support, fighting not just the Germans but also the limits of their own endurance. Their courage was unquestionable, their sacrifice was undeniable. But courage alone, Churchill knew, was not enough. Leadership mattered, judgment mattered. And in Arnhem, judgment had been tested, and perhaps found wanting. As the night deepened, Churchill returned to his desk, poring over maps and reports once more. He traced the route the troops had taken, noting every delay, every encounter, every misstep. He imagined himself in Montgomery's position, making decisions that would determine the lives of thousands. Could he, Churchill wondered, have done better? Perhaps, but that was not the question. The question was whether Montgomery had adapted when things went wrong, whether he had recognized the human cost and altered his plans accordingly. From all he had read, it seemed not. Monty had remained confident, precise, calculating, but perhaps too inflexible, too wedded to his original plan. Hours passed and Churchill's mind remained restless. He thought of the reports from the front lines, each one a testament to bravery and a reminder of the stakes. He thought of the soldiers trapped in Arnhem, holding out against overwhelming odds, and he felt a gnawing unease. For the first time in his career, he questioned the judgment of a man he had once trusted implicitly. Monty's mind was brilliant, yes, but brilliance without flexibility could be deadly. Precision without empathy could be catastrophic. And Churchill, who had always believed in the value of both, now faced the uncomfortable realization that his faith in Montgomery might have been misplaced. The Prime Minister sat back in his chair, exhausted but unable to sleep. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, unaware of the storm raging in the minds of its leaders. Churchill's thoughts circled back to the same image, paratroopers holding their ground in Arnhem, surrounded, outnumbered, waiting for reinforcements that might not come. He thought of Montgomery, calm and unshaken, reporting victories even as the reality on the ground grew grimmer by the hour. The contrast was stark, and Churchill could not reconcile the two. In that moment he realized something profound. Trust, once shaken, is not easily restored. A commander could be brilliant, a plan could be clever, but if the human cost is ignored, if lives are gambled on precision alone, then admiration is not enough. Churchill remained at his desk until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. The reports from Arnhem continued to arrive, each one painting a picture of courage, chaos, and tragedy. And in that quiet, pre-dawn hour, he made a decision, though he would not voice it immediately. His trust in Montgomery had been compromised. Not destroyed entirely, for Monty's brilliance could not be denied, but fractured irrevocably. The Prime Minister would continue to consult with him, continue to consider his advice, but the blind faith that had once existed was gone. Arnhem had changed everything. By the time the city woke to another day of wartime life, Churchill had already begun planning his next steps. He would gather his advisors, review alternative strategies, and consider other commanders who might offer not just brilliance, but judgment tempered with caution and empathy. Monty would continue to play his role in the war, but in Churchill's mind, the Field Marshal's confidence was now shadowed by doubt. Arnhem had been a crucible, testing both men and plans, and in its fire, Churchill had learned a harsh lesson. Even the greatest minds can falter, and even the most trusted leaders can disappoint when lives hang in the balance. The morning after the latest reports from Arnhem had reached London, the tension in Downing Street was almost palpable. Winston Churchill, despite his stoic public demeanor, was privately seething with unease and frustration. The Prime Minister had spent the previous night reviewing the countless dispatches from the front, tracing the path of the paratroopers, noting every delay, every miscommunication, every sign of peril. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, weighing strategy against consequence, bravery against folly, and at the center of it all was a man he had once trusted implicitly, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Churchill's aides moved quietly around the study, aware of the weight that hung in the air. Papers were shuffled, envelopes opened and closed, as the Prime Minister prepared to summon Montgomery to London. This would not be a ceremonial meeting or a routine briefing. This was a confrontation, an examination, a test of character. Churchill needed answers. He needed to understand how a plan so meticulously crafted could have gone so catastrophically wrong. And, more importantly, he needed to gauge the man responsible for it. When Montgomery arrived, he was every inch the image of composure. The Field Marshal's gait was purposeful, his posture erect, his face a mask of calm confidence. He carried himself as if the war itself were a chess game and he, its master player, moving pieces with precision and foresight. Churchill, by contrast, was restless, pacing as he waited, his hands often tapping the edge of the desk, his eyes sharp with scrutiny. The contrast between the two men could not have been more striking. One calm, methodical, unyielding, the other fiery, passionate, and unafraid to let emotion inform judgment. "Montgomery," Churchill began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and underlying tension. "I have read the reports from Arnhem. I have read them many times, and yet I find myself compelled to ask, how, in heaven's name, did this happen?" Montgomery stood silently for a moment, his eyes steady, meeting Churchill's gaze without flinching. He responded with a measured tone, deliberate, each word chosen with care. "Prime Minister, the operation was executed according to the plan we devised. Timing, coordination, and strategy were all followed as outlined. The challenges we faced were unforeseen in some respects, yes, but the plan itself remained sound." Churchill's eyes narrowed. He had expected defense, perhaps even justification, but not this unwavering certainty. Unforeseen? Unforeseen. "Monty, soldiers are dying in Arnhem. Supplies are late. Reinforcements are struggling to advance. What part of this do you consider merely unforeseen? How can one so meticulous be blind to the consequences unfolding in real time?" Montgomery's expression did not waver. "Prime Minister, the men were well trained, well prepared. The risks were inherent in any operation of this scale. I maintain that the strategy was sound. Circumstances, not planning, are what caused the difficulties." Churchill's hand clenched into a fist. "Circumstances, you say? Circumstances do not carry rifles, Monty. Circumstances do not parachute into enemy territory under fire. Circumstances do not face the Germans while waiting for reinforcements that never arrive on time. It is not the map or the plan that matters. It is the men, the human cost." Montgomery's calm remained unbroken, almost infuriatingly so. "Prime Minister, the human cost is regrettable, yes, but one cannot abandon strategy for sentiment. War is a harsh teacher. The goal was to secure the bridges and advance the Allies. The objective remains valid. The plan was the correct approach." Churchill leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Correct? Correct is a word for accountants and mathematicians, Monty. Correct does not honor the lives of soldiers who trusted you with their very survival. Correct does not forgive the delays that left them exposed, fighting against overwhelming odds. Correct is cold and lifeless. Leadership, judgment, wisdom, these are measured by the lives you preserve, not the neatness of your plans. There was a brief silence, the kind that filled rooms with tension so thick it seemed to weigh on the walls themselves. Montgomery, despite his composure, felt the weight of Churchill's words, not as accusation, but as expectation. He had known the Prime Minister to be forceful, even fiery, but this was something different, an edge of disappointment that cut deeper than any rebuke from fellow officers. "Prime Minister," Montgomery began, choosing his words with painstaking care, "I understand the concern. The paratroopers' bravery is undeniable. Their perseverance under such conditions is admirable. And I take full responsibility for the decisions made at headquarters. But one must recognize that war is never neat. Even the most careful planning cannot account for every variable." Churchill's voice grew sharper. Responsibility? Responsibility is not merely acknowledging it after the fact. Responsibility is anticipating danger, adapting to the situation, and acting to protect those under your command. You planned with precision, yes, but did you adapt when it mattered most? Did you show flexibility when lives depended on it? Or did arrogance blind you to the very chaos you were meant to navigate? Montgomery's jaw tightened, a subtle sign of tension beneath his otherwise stoic exterior. "Prime Minister, I do not believe arrogance dictates my actions. My judgment was applied to the best of my ability. The operation was executed with discipline, training, and courage. That is all one can ask of men in war." Churchill's face darkened. "Discipline and courage do not erase miscalculation, Monty. Courage alone cannot save men when the chain of command falters. Discipline is meaningless if it cannot respond to the demands of reality. You speak of execution as if strategy is a set of rules on a board, untouched by the suffering it causes. But real life, war, is measured in blood, sweat, and death, and in Arnhem, those measures were ignored in favor of your meticulous pride." For a long moment the two men regarded one another. Montgomery, unwavering, and Churchill, a storm of passion barely restrained by the veneer of statesmanship. Outside, London hummed with wartime life, oblivious to the clash of titans in a dimly lit room, a room where the fate of trust and judgment hung in the balance. "Prime Minister," Montgomery said finally, his tone calm but carrying a hint of insistence, "I understand your distress. I share your concern for the men, but to question the integrity of the plan based on the outcome alone is unfair. The plan was executed as designed. Failures occurred due to unpredictable variables, not misjudgment." Churchill slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the room. "Unfair? Do not lecture me on fairness, Monty. I am speaking of reality. I am speaking of lives lost. I am speaking of trust. I trusted you with a critical operation, and yet I am left wondering if your brilliance was clouded by overconfidence. Perhaps your mind is brilliant, Monty, but brilliance without humility, without adaptability, is a dangerous thing." Montgomery remained silent for a moment, his eyes steady. He knew the Prime Minister's words were not merely anger, they were disappointment, and disappointment cut deeper than anger, for it carried judgment. It carried the verdict that, in the eyes of Churchill, Montgomery's decision-making had failed at the most crucial moment. "Prime Minister," Montgomery said, his voice measured, "I acknowledge the outcome was less than ideal. I acknowledge the men faced difficulties beyond anticipation. I do not deny the human cost. But I maintain that the strategy itself was sound. The execution, the circumstances, and the bravery of the troops define the operation, not the singular misfortune that befell them." Churchill's gaze softened, though the intensity remained. "Monty, I do not question your courage or your intellect. I question your judgment when faced with the unpredictable, the chaos that is inevitable in war. Arnhem has shown me that brilliance alone is not enough. Leadership is tested in moments when plans unravel, and it is adaptability and care for human life that separates a commander from a mere tactician." Montgomery nodded slightly, recognizing the weight of Churchill's words, even as he maintained his composure. "I will take your counsel to heart, Prime Minister. I regret the difficulties faced at Arnhem. I have learned from the experience as I always do." Churchill exhaled slowly, the tension in his body easing marginally, but the doubt remained. Inwardly, he knew that trust, once shaken, could never be fully restored. He would continue to rely on Montgomery, for his skill was undeniable, but the blind faith he had once placed in the Field Marshal was gone. Arnhem had altered the relationship, introducing a fissure that would forever shape Churchill's view of Montgomery's command. As Montgomery departed, Churchill remained at his desk, staring at the maps and repo. RTS. He reflected on the meeting, on the unflinching confidence of Monty, and on the lives caught in the crossfire. He realized that admiration and brilliance, while vital, could not replace the careful balance of humility, adaptability, and human consideration. The lesson was bitter, but necessary. Leadership, Churchill understood, was as much about responding to chaos as it was about planning for order. By nightfall, Churchill had already begun to consider how he would approach future operations, how he would weigh Montgomery's advice alongside other commanders, and how he would ensure that the mistakes at Arnhem would not be repeated. The meeting had been tense, exhausting, and, in many ways, revelatory. Trust, he understood, was fragile, and in war, fragile trust could have consequences as severe as any enemy action. Churchill sat back in his chair, the weight of leadership pressing down on him. Outside, the city remained alive with the ordinary chaos of wartime London, but inside, a lesson had been etched deeply into the Prime Minister's mind. Even the most brilliant commander could falter, even the most meticulous plan could fail, and even trust, once lost, could never fully return. Arnhem had revealed the limits of Montgomery's judgment, and Churchill would carry that knowledge with him for the rest of the war, tempering admiration with caution, brilliance with skepticism, and strategy with humanity. The months following Arnhem were filled with both victories and lingering shadows. While the world outside celebrated the courage and audacity of Allied soldiers across Europe, Winston Churchill carried a private unease that no public acclaim could dispel. The images of Arnhem, paratroopers trapped in the city, fighting bravely against overwhelming odds, struggling to hold a bridge they had been ordered to secure, haunted him in quiet moments. The names and faces of those young men, so full of courage and hope, had become etched in his mind, a constant reminder of the consequences of decisions made far from the battlefield. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued to command with the same meticulous precision that had defined his career. His campaigns elsewhere, notably in Normandy and the liberation of northern France, cemented his reputation as a brilliant strategist. On paper, he was a hero. His victories were celebrated by generals, politicians, and the public alike. Newspapers lauded his name. Radio broadcasts carried his triumphs into homes across Britain and the United States, and morale soared among troops who admired his confidence and clarity of purpose. Yet, for Churchill, the memory of Arnhem cast a long and inescapable shadow over every subsequent operation. Even when Monty submitted new plans for major operations, Churchill read them with a critical eye sharpened by Arnhem. He noticed the same traits he had admired in North Africa and Normandy: boldness, clarity, precision. But he also noticed the rigid adherence to plans, the unwavering belief in timing and coordination, and the minimal allowance for the unpredictable nature of war. It was this rigidity that had doomed Arnhem, and Churchill knew that in another situation it could have dire consequences. Trust, once fractured, does not heal easily, and Churchill, despite his deep respect for Montgomery's intellect, could not shake the lingering doubt that had taken root in his mind during that tense meeting in London. Churchill often reflected on that day, the day he had confronted Montgomery, in the ornate briefing room of Downing Street. The clash had been more than an argument over strategy. It had been a collision of values. Montgomery valued precision, order, and the infallibility of well-laid plans. Churchill valued human judgment, adaptability, and a moral responsibility for the lives entrusted to leaders' care. The difference had not been merely philosophical, it had been fundamental, and in that difference Churchill had recognized a flaw, not in Montgomery's mind, but in his approach to command. Brilliance without flexibility, Churchill had realized, could become dangerous. The Prime Minister's concerns were not idle. Even as Montgomery continued to achieve victories, reports from the front lines occasionally highlighted instances where his strict adherence to planning caused delays, miscalculations, or unnecessary risks. These were often mitigated by the skill and bravery of subordinate officers, the courage of soldiers in the field, or sheer luck. But for Churchill, each example reinforced the lesson of Arnhem. No commander, however brilliant, was immune to error when inflexibility met chaos. And in war, error could mean lives lost, operations compromised, and momentum squandered. By late 1944, Churchill had begun to adjust his reliance on Montgomery. He still consulted him, still valued his strategic mind, but he balanced Monty's input with that of other commanders who demonstrated not only brilliance, but judgment tempered by caution and adaptability. General Eisenhower, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, and other senior officers provided perspectives that Churchill found reassuring, voices that acknowledged risk, accounted for the human cost, and were willing to revise plans when circumstances demanded it. Montgomery's advice remained a valuable component of decision-making, but it was no longer the singular voice guiding the Prime Minister's trust. In private correspondence, Churchill expressed his ongoing concerns. Letters to aides and confidants revealed his unease, his reflections on leadership, and his recognition that Arnhem had marked a turning point. "Montgomery's mind is brilliant, his courage undeniable," he wrote, "but I shall never again place my full trust in him to bear the burden of men's lives without question. Arnhem has taught a lesson I cannot ignore. Precision is necessary, but so is judgment. Strategy is vital, but so is care. Leadership is measured in the balance of both." These words, penned in quiet contemplation, underscored a permanent shift in Churchill's perception of the field marshal. Montgomery, for his part, continued to carry out his duties with the same discipline and focus that had characterized his career. He achieved tactical victories, inspired confidence among his troops, and contributed significantly to the Allied advance into Germany. Publicly, he remained untouchable, a figure of military genius whose reputation was near legendary. But Churchill, whose mind always weighed both outcome and morality, could not be swayed by public acclaim alone. In his eyes, Arnhem was a cautionary tale, a brilliant plan executed flawlessly on paper but faltering in reality, revealing the limitations of even the greatest minds when confronted with unpredictability and human cost. Churchill often returned in thought to the soldiers themselves. He recalled the paratroopers' struggle to hold the city, their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, and the letters from officers detailing acts of extraordinary courage. These men, brave beyond measure, had relied on Montgomery's judgment. Their faith, their trust, had been tested in ways that few could imagine, and for Churchill, the memory of their ordeal remained a moral compass. Leadership, he believed, was not only about winning battles, but also about safeguarding those who fight them. And Arnhem had demonstrated that even the most celebrated strategists could fall short in that responsibility. As the war progressed into its final months, Churchill's skepticism influenced the distribution of command responsibilities. He continued to support Montgomery where necessary, recognizing his skill and experience, but he also empowered other commanders whose judgment reflected adaptability and attentiveness to the human element. This approach ensured that while Montgomery's brilliance contributed to strategic planning, decisions were cross-checked, tempered, and balanced by the perspectives of others. Churchill's distrust was not an act of malice, but a pragmatic response, a recognition that relying on infallibility was a dangerous gamble. The psychological impact on Churchill was profound. Arnhem had altered his understanding of command, trust, and the human dimension of strategy. He had always believed that brilliance and courage were the hallmarks of leadership, but Arnhem revealed that they were insufficient on their own. Flexibility, humility, and moral consideration were equally critical. Montgomery's unwavering confidence, once a source of reassurance, now carried a warning. Brilliance, if untempered by empathy and adaptability, could be as hazardous as incompetence. Churchill's reflections extended beyond Montgomery himself. He considered the broader lessons of war, the delicate interplay between strategy, human cost, and leadership. He recognized that history would remember Montgomery as a hero, lauding victories and celebrating audacity. But Churchill, who had lived through the decisions, the debates, and the consequences, understood a subtler truth. Even heroes are flawed, and trust, once shaken, is never easily restored. The Prime Minister's admiration remained, but it was now tempered by a quiet caution, a vigilance informed by the experience at Arnhem. When victory in Europe was finally achieved, the world celebrated the end of conflict, the liberation of occupied territories, and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Montgomery's role was widely acknowledged. His tactical genius was praised in newspapers, histories, and public ceremonies. Yet for Churchill, Arnhem lingered as a personal and enduring memory. It was a reminder that leadership is measured not only in victories and accolades, but also in the care with which decisions are made and the lives preserved along the way. The memory of Arnhem, of the men trapped, and the plans that faltered, remained a cautionary tale, a lens through which all subsequent judgments of command were filtered. Churchill would often recount Arnhem in private conversations, emphasizing the lessons it offered about humility, judgment, and moral responsibility. He reflected on the necessity of balancing audacity with caution, precision with flexibility, and brilliance with empathy. Montgomery, he recognized, would continue to be celebrated by history, but for Churchill, the Field Marshal's legacy was inevitably intertwined with the memory of that operation, an operation that revealed both genius and limitation, confidence and inflexibility, brilliance and danger. In the years that followed, Churchill's writings and reflections on the war frequently touched upon Arnhem. He never publicly disparaged Montgomery, nor did he diminish the Field Marshal's contributions to the Allied victory. Instead, he framed the memory as a lesson, a reminder that leadership is a complex human endeavor, measured not only by the outcomes achieved, but also by the lives affected and the judgment exercised. For Churchill, Arnhem was more than a battle. It was a crucible that tested trust, revealed the limits of even the greatest minds, and underscored the enduring importance of humility, adaptability, and moral responsibility in leadership. As the sun set over London one evening, Churchill sat alone in his study, maps of Europe spread before him. The war finally concluded. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, thinking of the soldiers who had fought and died, of the triumphs and failures, and of the men who had led them. Montgomery's name, once synonymous with infallible brilliance in his mind, now carried a more complex resonance, respect, acknowledgement, but also caution, doubt, and the enduring lesson of Arnhem. In that quiet, Churchill understood that history would remember victories, medals, and headlines, but the weight of leadership, the responsibility for lives entrusted to commanders, was a burden that lingered long after the battles had ended. And so Arnhem remained with Churchill, a persistent reminder that trust is fragile, brilliance is insufficient without wisdom, and leadership is measured as much by the care for men's lives as by the glory of victory. Montgomery would be celebrated, and rightly so, for his achievements, But in Churchill's eyes, the Field Marshal was forever marked by that operation. Trust, once broken, had been permanently altered, and the memory of Arnhem would continue to guide the Prime Minister's judgments, decisions, and reflections on the human dimension of war.